My name is Kami, and I'm going to tell you my story today. If you're watching this video, you probably know me, or you know someone who's connected to me, or you've watched me on some of my social media sites. But anyway, welcome. Welcome to my story. I've dubbed my story The Journey of My Heart because it actually goes from a time in my life where my heart was full of pain, loss, heartache, to a time now where my heart is full of life and love and passion. And I want to share that story with you. I want to give you hope. I want to give you redemption. I want to give you just a belief that God is good. And so if you follow any of my stuff, you will know that I am a pastor. I run a chaplain program in a hospital. I have 5 amazing children. I have one other child who lives in heaven with Jesus. I'm married to a wonderful man for 29 years. We're madly in love with each other and our best friends. And I also am a whole yoga instructor, and I just recently also became a health coach for nutrition. So got a lot going on in my life, but it wasn't always the case. I actually have a website called Living Fully Alive, and my passion in life is to help people live fully alive, body, soul, and spirit. And in order to do that, we actually have to be healthy and whole in all 3 of those areas, in our spirit, in our soul, and in our body. And how do we do that? Well, I often believe that the thing that we were called to do is sometimes the thing that stops us in life. And so realizing that, my story makes a whole lot of sense. And so I would just love to share my story with you today, and I hope that it brings you courage, and it brings you hope, and it brings you life. And so starting out for me, I was not always full of life and passion. In fact, if you would have met me 10 years ago, you would not recognize me today. I'm a completely different person than I was 10 years ago. Not only in my looks, but in the whole persona of who I am, I'm a completely different person. And so my story really starts out when I was about, that I can remember, is when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I remember even then the longing in my heart to be known and to be loved, especially by God. I wanted to have that assurance that I was accepted and that I was loved by God and by others. And that wasn't really the message that my little brain heard as I was growing up. I lived in a very conservative Christian culture, grew up going to a home church, very sheltered, very tiny little town that I lived in, and just more Old Testament, old school type preaching, if that makes sense to you. It was very hellfire and damnation. And I really believe that I was very spiritual even as a young child, and I really, really wanted to know that love of God. But it wasn't something that my brain heard or understood when I was little. Most all of us, I guess, sing the song when we're little that, God loves me, the Bible tells me so, whatever. I believed that in a sense that he loved me, but he didn't really like me. There's a big difference. My husband and I will often say to each other, I really like you, because there's a difference in feeling like someone has to love you, like because the Bible says God has to love us. There's a difference when somebody really likes you because they want to like you. And so I guess that was the difference for me growing up. I heard a lot of scary stories, a lot of hellfire and damnation. I heard a lot of you have to be perfect in order to go to heaven. For me, life was really about heaven and hell, and again, I don't know that that was what was meant to be told to me, but that's what came across to my brain. I really believe that we are often products of our environment. We're products of the way we were raised, the culture that we live in. most all of us are products of the media and products of what we hear, the messages that we hear on TV, maybe the messages we hear in our religious environments, the messages that we hear from our parents. And we take all of those in and we actually build and develop our belief systems from those. Well, that's what I did as a small child. What I heard from my environment, from the culture I lived in, from growing up, from what my brain understood, was that if I wasn't perfect, then I was going to hell, or I wasn't going to be accepted. And that crushed my heart. My heart actually felt broken from the time I can remember. Now, on the outside, everything looked perfect. I was like your perfect child. I did all the right things. I obeyed every rule. I was a 4.0 student. I was the valedictorian of my high school. I did everything my parents told me to do. I followed all the rules. I tried to do everything in the Bible that I was told we had to do because I really, really, really wanted God to like me. But never, ever, ever did I feel like I could measure up. Did I feel that I could be that perfect to be able to go to heaven? I never had an assurance of my faith that I would make it to heaven, that God liked me. And so I spent almost all of my life performing for people's love, performing for acceptance, but it never worked. I tried, and inside I always felt like I never measured up. I don't know if any of you can relate to that, but that really was my my internal world growing up. Again, like I said, most people thought I had the perfect life. You know, I was the perfect child. I was the perfect student. I married the perfect guy. We had the perfect children. You know, even once we got married and had our family, our kids were perfect because I made sure our house was perfect. I made sure they were perfect. I homeschooled my kids just like I was told that we needed to do, and I homeschooled them well, and they were great students, and they grew up to be amazing kids. But in the process of all of that, none of that changed the way I felt in my heart. And it eventually came to this point where whenever I made a mistake, I actually could not handle it myself. Like, I actually believed that I was broken, that there was something wrong with me, that God couldn't like me, and therefore I began to not like myself. I actually remember telling myself many occasions that I hated myself, you know, because I couldn't be perfect. I couldn't be perfect enough. Again, no one else knew about this. It was my internal world. I often felt like I was going to go crazy because there was such a difference between what my life looked like and what my internal world looked like. Sometimes this is a shock to the people who knew me then, that that's actually what my internal world looked like. But that's what it was. And none of that changed for years and years until one day, my husband and I's second child got sick, and he was diagnosed with a very rare autoimmune disease that was incurable. Now, in our environment growing up, which we actually moved back to when we started having our children and all of that, because we wanted to make sure that they had that perfect upbringing like I did, and you know, that they would be going to heaven and not to hell. We moved back to that environment, and we were there raising our children. And in that environment, we did not know many people who were ever sick. We all had lots of kids, and none of our children had ever been born. You know, we'd never had stillbirths. None of our kids had ever been born with any defects or any, you know, problems. And so this was a big shock to our environment, to our culture, to where we lived, especially to me and my husband, obviously. Because of the culture we grew up in, and not that it was preached, it wasn't preached that doctors were evil or any of that kind of stuff, but it was kind of a known fact that everything happens for a reason, and that God has, a reason why he does everything. And so if you were sick, if something like that happened, God was either teaching you a lesson, or there must be sin in your life, or something like that. And I remember when our son got sick, doing lots of internal, he's sick because we must have sin in our life. And my husband and I dug inside and tried to find everything that was wrong with us, to try to get rid of so that we could heal our son. To some of you, that may seem like correct theology, and to others of you listening to this story, that may seem very harsh and cruel. But it's all that we knew at the time. And we actually had several of our people in our culture and our environment, and even family, all coming out of love, but coming to tell us that the reason our son must be sick must be because we had sin in our life, or he must have sin in his life, or God's teaching us a lesson. At first, that seemed okay, but when you start to see your child be tortured by a disease, and you see your child in pain, and you see your child maybe ask you the question, "Why me, Mom?" You start to wonder, would a loving father actually do this to a child? It's the first time we ever had to question something like that. The first time we ever had to look at what we believed and question what we'd been taught. I think growing up, I always had a lot of questions. I remember hearing stories that didn't make sense to me. Stories of, things in the Old Testament that supposedly God did that didn't look like love, and didn't look like something a loving father would do. But I never was able to ask those questions. I never felt free, or felt that I had a safe place to process out some of the stories with people, or figure out why something looked the way it did in the Old Testament. And so when something like this happens to you, or happens to your family, you actually begin to look at what do I believe? Is this correct? Would a loving God actually do this to a child? Again, our son was 12. He had been homeschooled all of his life. He really hadn't done anything that horrible in his life to, I guess we would say, deserve a punishment like this. Now, I had no problem believing that I deserved that. Again, I had never felt accepted by God. I had never felt good enough. So it was very easy for me to believe that somehow we were being punished, or we were, that God was teaching us some kind of lesson. We actually had family and friends come, and I know they were trying to do it out of love, but come, and it's all that we knew. So I get that, but come and tell us that, your son is sick because you guys must have sin in your life, or your son is sick because he must have sin in his life. And our son was a very, very accomplished student, and he was a very accomplished athlete. And we did have somebody come and tell us that your son is sick because he's too proud. We had someone come and tell us that our son was sick because I didn't obey my husband, or whatever that is. But the last straw really for me was someone coming and telling us that our son must be sick because he has pride in his life, or whatever. And I remember jumping up off the couch, and I remember running into the kitchen and throwing pots and pans around. And I remember saying, if this is who God is, if he tortures children because they may have some kind of sin in their life, then I don't want anything to do with him. I'm done. I'm really done. After that point, we actually ended up in the hospital twice with our son. He ended up getting so bad that he lost 13 pounds in 5 days, and we had to take him to the emergency room, and they shipped us up to a children's hospital. when we got there, a lot of specialists came in to see him, and they pretty much sat there and argued about what they thought he had. None of them really having a good idea of what was going on with him. His diagnosis or his disease didn't present in the way that they were used to, and they didn't know how to treat it. While we were in the hospital with our son, we were there not very long, and his intestines actually ruptured, and they rushed him into surgery. And I remember the doctor coming out and telling us that he was the sickest kid at the hospital, and that they actually really didn't expect him to make it. He did make it, and we were in the hospital probably for 6 months. And in that period of time, my husband and I began to research the gospel. We began to read the Bible. We began to grab anything and everything we could find out there from people who had a different view of God than us, people who believed that God was good, that God didn't make people sick. We began to listen to podcasts and listen to CDs and stuff of people who experienced a lot of miracles and healing. Our son came home after about 6 months, and he pretty much had to learn how to do a lot of things over again. He got so weak, he had to learn how to walk again. He had to learn, his body could not take in enough food and calories as he needed, and so we had to help supplement feed him. By this time, he was about 13, and he got better for a little while, and then he actually crashed again, and we ended up back in the hospital again. And this time, his intestines ruptured again, and he was in a coma for a month. And when he came out of surgery, the doctors said that they were not even able to touch his intestines, because every time they touched him, they fell apart like toilet paper. And they packed him in ice, and for a month he was in a coma. And I remember being so angry at God at this point. I remember having a conversation with him, and prior to entering the hospital, again, I was a very spiritual person. I felt like I had a connection with God. Again, I knew he had to love me, but I didn't feel like he really liked me. And I had this conversation with God that we had prayed for our son many times, and I really believed that God was going to heal him. I believe that God had spoken that to me several times. And so I had this conversation on the way over from the Ronald McDonald House that my husband and I were staying at to our son's room at the ICU when he was in a coma. My husband had called me at one point and said, "You need to get over here because they don't think that he's going to last more than a couple hours." And I remember on the way over, I remember telling God, if my son passes away right now, then you are not who you said you are, and I will have nothing to do with you. Miraculously, our son made it through that as well. We ended up in the hospital again for a really long time at that period, for him to recover from that. And this time he didn't completely recover. He ended up being in a wheelchair, not being able to walk again, very malnourished. His body was not able to take in enough nutrients. He actually had an open wound on his stomach that wouldn't heal because he, by this time, didn't have an immune system. They had actually killed his immune system because it was his immune system that was attacking his own body. And through the process of us being at the hospital, we continued to research, and we continued to try to find God in all of this. Like, where was God? What is happening? My husband and I actually ended up hearing about a church in a neighboring state that really believed in healing and saw lots of miracles, and we decided to visit there. My husband and I signed up for a conference. It was called a Healing Hem of His Garment conference, and we went to this conference while our son was still at the hospital. And when we were there, it was amazing. 3 times during the event, different speakers called my husband out of the audience and just spoke words of life over him. And just, we had 3 questions that we asked God on the way up there. We were like, God, we need you to answer these 3 questions for us. We need to understand, what's happening. And one of the questions was about fasting. I mean, we were trying to perform for our son's healing. We were trying to fast for his healing. And I know that one of the speakers spoke right into that about fasting and how you can't earn a healing. It's not about earning a healing, that Jesus actually already accomplished healing for us on the cross. We had a couple other questions, and both of the other questions were answered for us as well by people calling my husband out of the audience and speaking directly to him, and it answered the other two questions. And so we actually made a decision then and there that we were going to move our family from the only place we had ever known and we had ever lived to this new environment, this new culture, this culture that believed in a really good God, a really big God, and one who heals and one who restores and redeems, not one who punishes, and one who tries to teach you a lesson, and one who tortures you even though Jesus already had done that for us. And so we actually packed up our family and we moved when our son got discharged from the hospital. The hospital, the doctors, they all thought we were crazy. We were moving to another state, to a town that didn't have any specialists. But miraculously, the child life specialist at the hospital, the social worker, kind of knew that we were planning something, and she actually worked it out for us to be able to do this. And she really blessed our family to be able to do this. And we moved to a new culture, to a place in a town where we knew no one. But we knew that we needed life, and we needed a different paradigm, a different view of who God was. So we moved our family to this new place, and my husband actually signed up for their ministry school and was accepted. And so the whole entire next year, my husband began to go to a ministry school, and he would come home every day from school and tell me how amazing I was and how beautiful I was. And by this time, I was still trying to figure out who God was. I was very suicidal. I was trying to take care of our son, who was now in a wheelchair, who needed lots of medications. He needed extra food that he couldn't get by mouth. We had to put, in a tube. It just very complicated life for us now. I was still homeschooling some of my kids. And I was just very suicidal because I still didn't have a good idea of who God was and why we were going through this. And so eventually my husband, he never stopped doing that. He would come home every single day and say, "You're amazing, you're beautiful, I love you," that kind of thing. And he eventually wore me down enough to go, if my husband, who is only human, could think that of me, then God has to be able to think that of me as well. He has to know that there's something good inside of me if my husband can see it. I also then decided to take some classes at this church where we were going to now. One of the classes was it was called Redeeming All the Pieces. And it was talking about all those hurts and pains and those shattered parts of us that were actually broken from, whether that was childhood or events that had happened to us, or just belief systems that we had been taught that weren't actually true. And for the very first time in my life, someone validated that pain that was in my heart. Someone validated the fact that I somehow picked up a belief system that said God didn't really like me, and that was not true, and that I had to perform for my acceptance, and how that was never meant to be how we were to live our life. And all the pain of all those years of carrying that were actually validated in my heart. And for the very first time, I could grieve and I could cry all those wasted years that I had spent believing that I was worthless and I wasn't worth anything and I wasn't worth being loved. And I remember driving home from that class once a week, and I remember just crying and just having Holy Spirit wash over me, just healing, just love and healing. I took another class that was kind of more of a one-on-one counseling class. I met with a lady, and she actually asked me to remember a childhood memory where there was a lot of pain. And so I came up with a memory that I could remember where I felt a lot of pain, and she asked me if I could go back to that memory. And I know that sounds pretty funny, but it was really easy for me to go back to that memory. And she asked me to be that little girl again, and to be in that memory as that little girl. And as I was there, she asked me to look around and see if I could see Jesus anywhere. And I remember looking around, and I remember seeing Jesus in the room with me. And she asked me to see what he was doing. And I looked at Jesus, and he was actually crying. And the revelation came that Jesus was actually crying for me, because he did not will or decree that event to happen. It was not his will that experience that I went through, he did not plan that. That wasn't something that he wanted to happen. And he was actually crying for me. I know that there's often a belief system or a phrase out there that we sometimes say that everything happens for a reason, or that, God, everything that happens, God somehow orchestrates. But I don't actually believe that's true anymore. Because of God's love for us, he never forces himself on anyone. And so that's why bad things can happen. And that's why people do things that hurt others, is because God does not force himself on people and make them do what he wants them to do, or make them do something different than what they have done. He doesn't force himself on anyone. And so that experience actually was healed in that moment when I actually saw Jesus crying for me. Like, he didn't actually want that event to happen. And just as he was feeling my pain, he was crying tears for me. And that changed a lot of my perspective of who God is and how things happen that are awful on this earth right now. It's not always his will. He does not decree bad things. He does not make bad things happen for some kind of specific reason, to teach us a lesson or anything like that. He doesn't need to teach us a lesson. Jesus took care of all of that. God was actually in Christ when he died on the cross to take away pain and suffering and all of that for us. And so anyway, all of this healing began to happen in my heart. And I actually ended up signing up for that same ministry school that my husband also did the year before. And I knew that it was going to be difficult for me to do the school, plus take care of my kids and, take care of my son and all of that kind of stuff. So I began to read all the required books and do all the book reports that were required for this ministry school ahead of time. And as I began to read it, God just began to really break down all of those belief systems and all of those lies that I actually had believed about him that were not actually true. And just all of this healing began to happen in my heart. Ironically, about a month before the school was going to start, our son actually ended up back in the hospital, and he ended up passing away. And as awful as that event was, there was so much supernatural God presence in his passing that it's really difficult for us as a family to live in a lot of grief of what happened. God has so restored our family and has so healed everything that had transpired, that in that moment we knew that we were covered. We knew that God and his presence were there with us. Each one of my children actually had to have their own journey through grief, but our son's name, we didn't know it at the time when he was born, but our son that passed away, his name actually means victory for the people. His name is Cole, and it actually means victory for the people. And we know, and we without a doubt, that he and his circumstance and his life set our family free from what we would call religion. Religion really is the institution of rules and performance and earning acceptance or love, where that is not what the gospel is at all. And so we believe that our son set our family free, and he has set not only us free, but a lot of people free from religion and into an amazing relationship with a God who loves us just the way we are. We don't have to change it all for him to love us. We don't have to perform. We don't have to do any of that. His grace is sufficient for all of that. His grace actually is what saves us. It's not our performance. It's not our ability to be perfect. And all of us, my family and all of my children, know that our son in heaven would say to us this day that he would do it all over again to set our family free. God has actually redeemed and restored everything. We feel like everything in our life has been redeemed. I ended up doing the ministry school for a year, and when that year was over, I was asked by a local hospital if I would come and be their spiritual covering, which to me is the most redemptive thing I could even think of for my life, for our family's life. So we lost a child to this earth. I mean, we honestly don't feel like we lost him because we know exactly where he is. And myself and my family, each one of us have had encounters with our son and with our sibling, our children's sibling in heaven. Like, they have seen their brother in heaven. They have had encounters with him. And so each one of us had our own journey of our heart to bring that healing. But then God does something amazing on top of that. He makes me a chaplain of a hospital, and he begins to manifest his presence in the hospital to where I go in and I am able to pray over people who are dying and see them healed and whole. There was a gentleman who was in a coma, and they were telling the family that there was nothing they could do, and that, you know, all the signs pointed to this person never coming back or coming out of a coma. And I got to go in and pray for this person, and I went in and prayed, and as soon as I prayed, his numbers started to even out. And the next couple days, as I went in, he just kept getting better and better, to the point where he got off all the machines. He had the ability to talk to me, and he actually ended up being released from the hospital. And so, so many miracles and so much life has come from what we experienced, that I know I was made for this and I was born for this. I tell people that my calling in life is to dismantle the religious spirit. And for us, that means setting people free from a list of rules, setting people free from an institutionalized form of doing, to an incredible, amazing, intimate relationship with Jesus, who actually is your salvation. He is your life. He is your perfection. He is everything that you will ever need. And he did it, and you don't have to. And so you get to be fully you, and you get to be loved, and you get to be accepted right where you're at. And so if my story at all can inspire you, or can at least show you hope from loss, or can show you life from death, that is who I am, and that is what my whole story is about.